Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Riverside Insights here from the Experts webinar. My name is Anna Hausman, and I'm head of marketing for the group side of our business at Riverside Insights. And I'm so thrilled today to have two of our esteemed experts talking to us about how to interpret data in a post-COVID world. So we'll launch into some learning objectives shortly, but I want to quickly say I'm joined today by my wonderful colleague, Vicki Thomas, who's the head of product on the group side, and she and I will be tag teaming some questions throughout. So as questions come up through this presentation, please drop them in the Q&A panel. You should see that on hopefully the right side of your screen, and we will ensure to bring up your questions as they come up throughout the conversation. A few other housekeeping items. All of our webinars after this will be housed on our Riverside Insights website. You can go to info.riversideinsights.com and actually get all of our recordings from previous webinars. We will also be sure to send out this webinar recording along with the slides and certificates of attendance to you within the next few days. So be on the lookout for that in your inbox. But without further ado, we are so excited today to have our two Iowa assessments authors, Dr. Cathy Welch and Dr. Steve Dunbar. And I will pass it over to you both to introduce yourselves before we get going.
Thanks, Anna. I'm Cathy Welch. It's a pleasure to be here, talk to so many people about important issues of assessment. I work at the University of Iowa. I have the privilege of working both with graduate students and faculty, as well as with the state department here in the state of Iowa as we work on the state assessment program as well. So thank you for the opportunity.
And I'm Steve Dunbar. Along with Cathy, I'm co-director of a research and development unit in the College of Education at Iowa, known as Iowa Testing Programs. The Iowa Testing Programs history goes back farther than either of us want to talk about, but it has been a long tradition of reliable and valid assessment development here at the university and throughout the nation.
Well, we are so excited to have you both. It's a true privilege to be on a webinar with you both, talking about your research, talking about your insights, and talking about the practical application of what you're studying in the classroom. So a big, I know you'll jump into this in just a second, but this webinar is really about how do we interpret some of this post-COVID achievement data we're seeing? How do we use assessments with post-COVID norm or pre-COVID norms? How do we look at longitudinal growth from pre to during to post-COVID? And what do we do with this widening achievement gap that we're seeing in specific subjects, especially and with certain populations of students? So we are really excited to hear from our experts today to learn a little bit about the research that you're working on and to think about how we can actually practically ensure that we're catching students up as needed and moving students forward in a post-pandemic world. So without further ado, I will go ahead and pass it over to both of you.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'm gonna turn down our camera and go forward. First, we wanted to thank everybody for being here again. So, and we know from at least the registration list that there's a broad audience that's joining us today: administrative, classroom teachers, people that are charged with different responsibilities within the student population within your buildings, district, state. So we appreciate the broad perspective, and we hope we can make the presentation resonate in different ways with different audiences. Thank you, Anna. The next slide sort of gives us sort of the four different primary topics we want to touch upon today. Like, as Anna said, where are we post-COVID? We've spent a lot of time in the nation thinking about things immediately post-COVID. Now it's 2023, where are we? How are there two different metrics, both a norm-based metric and a growth metric, that can help us understand and interpret and move forward? And then what can we do from an assessment? How can we engage educators to really dive in and understand the data that they have to plan accordingly? So that's where we hope to go. So let's jump right in. The first, where are we post-COVID? That next slide, and you can just, Anna, go even past the next one. I think the positive is that we're in a recovery mode. Everybody in 2022 was showing some positive gain when compared to 2021. It wasn't necessarily consistent across every group or every state or every district, but overall there was positive gain. Does it mean that we were back to where we were before? Absolutely not. Does it suggest that we've made up for those losses in the meantime? Absolutely not. But the recovery itself is the good news, I think. The next few slides, the next one has to do with NAEP in particular, which I think, given the broadness of today's audience, we decided to focus first on what NAEP is telling us, and then we brought in some of our own state results to sort of put both the national against the state perspectives. You can see in NAEP, grades 4 and grade 8 on the slide here in mathematics saw the greatest decline in grade 8 with an 8-point decrease and 5-point decrease in grade 4. Both significant decreases in the last few years. The graphs themselves take you back to the original year of 1990 as a point of reference. But if you concentrate on the last few years, 19 to 22, you can see those decreases. Saw similar decreases on the next slide in reading, however, not quite as significant. 3-point decrease in grade 4 and similar decrease in grade 8. So again, you might notice from looking at all these slides, reading for both of these grades remained fairly constant for the years coming into it and was a fairly stable sort of historical going back to the year 2002 or so. It's been fairly stable. And so the 3-point decrease here is something to pay attention to as well.
One of the remarkable things about the NAEP data in a previous slide with respect to mathematics was that over the long span of time since the National Assessment of Educational Progress has been doing what they call a long-term trend analysis, the overall achievement in mathematics has improved markedly relative to reading over that period of time. And the loss that occurred in the last 2 years for NAEP is much smaller than the overall increase over that span of time. So that helps contextualize the nuance really kind of required in order to understand thoroughly what long-term trends are and how we might be thinking about the short-term trend downward that we've been looking at during the COVID period. What we've seen in the COVID period in the most recent NAEP results are a couple of fairly stable trends. That the pandemic affected students who are scoring in the lower regions of the achievement continuum, and what we're interested in is how it is that those students in those lowest regions are going to recover. The other thing that I think that's important to understand in the NAEP results, when you dig more deeply than we are here into state by state results, that the results have varied drastically by state, in part, no doubt, because states had different responses to the way their schools, either statewide or locally, were responding to the pandemic through remote learning opportunities or through return to the classroom. So the next couple of slides are just a couple of touch points with regard to differences that we saw for different groups in the national assessment results. This slide is simply to demonstrate that in both reading and mathematics, the declines were greater in the lowest regions of the NAEP performance scale at the 25th and 50th and 10th percentiles. Those declines in reading are up to 5 times greater than they are at the highest regions of the NAEP scale. The differences are similar in mathematics. So big takeaway to watch for as we look at other results related to this is be aware of what's happening to lower performing students. The next slide looks at students with respect to whether they were eligible for the National School Lunch Program. We call this free and reduced lunch in our state. It technically has that other acronym. Students who were eligible for free and reduced lunch are in the first two graphs, and their declines of 6 and 8 points in mathematics, you can see, are greater than the declines of students who are not eligible for free and reduced lunch. This is NAEP's surrogate, as well as the surrogate in many states for socioeconomic status at the individual level. If students are eligible for FRL, you folks all sort of know what that means in the public schools. So again, a kind of group difference that schools are wanting to pay attention to in both reading and mathematics. The following slide is specific to the state of Iowa, and it really reflects some of the nuances that are observed in state-by-state results from NAEP. Generally speaking, students in Iowa performed better relative to their pre-COVID years than was true in other states. But we found one exception in the area of reading, and this may seem a little counterintuitive compared to what I said about students who are low performing versus students who are high performing. But in this particular assessment of grade 3 reading, we found between 2019 and 2021, which was the first post-pandemic assessment, we found dramatic drops in 3rd grade reading. And if you think about who these students are, they were students who were in the spring of the year in 1st grade, who were in remote learning situations in all of 2nd grade, and then who were assessed in 3rd grade. And those critical years of grades 1 and 2 in the area of early reading were things that were really affected dramatically by instructional conditions and the interruptions of instruction. And these effects we saw at all regions of the score scale, whether we were talking about high performing students, middle performing students, or low performing students. The next slide shows another variation which we found in 3rd grade, and that is that mathematics scores, which in most of the national reports and even in some of our grades in Iowa were shown to be negatively affected by the pandemic. In 3rd grade mathematics, well, our students at all achievement levels were relatively stable. We don't have a good explanation for this result. It's just a result we thought we'd present to make the point that you should be looking carefully at your own district results in order to understand them, and rather than assume that your patterns and trends are like those reported in the nation or in your state, that you might find some differences if you begin to look closely. The next 2 slides just illustrate some parallels to the NAEP results that I talked about earlier. These are comparisons before and after the pandemic of the achievement gap between students who are eligible and not eligible for free and reduced lunch. And as you can see, over the span of 2019 to 2022, the achievement gap for students in grades 3, 5, and 6, which are the years of the assessment before and after, the achievement gap was about 1.5 times as large in 2022 as it was before the pandemic. This is in English language arts. The same thing in the next slide for students who have an IEP and students who do not. IEP definitions vary by state, but in general, IEP students in the state of Iowa are those who have some kind of special learning needs that are addressed through an individualized educational program. The gap here again is about, well, it's about 2/3 larger in 2022 than it is in 2021.
So the next slide sort of brings us back. So what we're saying is, yes, we've all seen all the results for the last 2 years. We've understood that there's changes at the state level, there's changes at the national level. What we're encouraging people to do today is to think more specifically about your building or your district and understand what it is that has happened. I think a lot of the literature and what we're trying to better understand here in our state is to better understand how the differences we saw interacted with what was happening in the classroom, in the buildings, and so forth. So looking at various things, the remote versus the in-person learning, understanding and trying to quantify the quality of the remote learning programs that were in place, understanding technology access, even things as testing policies and who was in and who was not included in testing, even as far out as 2021 and 2022 is a very critical element to understanding what you can say or what you want to sort of be cautious about saying. And then what of the recovery efforts and looking at even the differences in 22 to this current year of 2023 when you have yet additional data points to compare to. So the next couple slides just show how we're trying to better understand within the state of Iowa. And I only show these as examples. We're not going to go into this at all, but if you look at the two graphs on your screen, the graph on the left, cohort 1, are the students that started as 3rd graders in the state of Iowa and are now, well, we've matched them through 6th grade. So from 2019, obviously 2020, they were not in testing, but they were there in 2021 and 2022. The different lines show are indicators of different districts. The blue line, or dark blue line in this case, is the state. So you'll see one sort of darker line running through the middle of those. But the others are small to medium to large size districts that we've masked here to better understand the variability here. We have some districts that are well below even the state average. We have some districts that are above the state average, significantly above the state average. And what we're trying to do is put that information together with how they return to learn, what their learning recovery strategies are to gain a better understanding. These very different patterns, I think, are part of the message we want to convey, in that don't get lost in just these sweeping generalizations that we keep reading about, which are very critical, but for you on the ground, very interested in your students, your student population, digging deeper is going to be more valuable. The next slide is just another one that helps show district change in a different way. And this demonstrates some of the loss lingered, others recovered more quickly. So just a different way, using a different metric of growth, student growth percentile, the distributions for those same districts to better understand what was happening at the district level.
With respect to the variation that we're finding district by district, if you go back just for a minute, if all districts were the same with respect to growth over time in these 2-year periods, 18 to 19, 19 to 21, 21 to 22, these graphs would all be sort of a horizontal line right in the middle, like the darker line that you can see that represents the entire state. The fact that we're seeing this kind of variation is an indication of how different the response to the pandemic is in these various districts. And it's that kind of variability that we want to emphasize in your own examination of district level data to be sure that you're making the right inferences about how your schools have responded to the pandemic and how your recovery is proceeding going forward.
So the next slide is just a summary of where we've been. So before we get into norms and growth metrics, just think about, again, your students, paying very close attention to the change, the performance trajectories for your students, understanding your own student population, and also what happened within your district, within your state, that allowed you to successfully or not so successfully implement a recovery loss. So, okay, so the next section is about norms and primarily this section and the next is really about the introduction of metrics that can help us really interpret in different ways, because overall it's really the complement of this information that gives us a more comprehensive view of individual students as well as groups of students as well as districts and states as we think about moving forward. So the next slide is just quick. I think we're used to different metrics, but many states, they rely primarily on proficiency indicators, whether that child is proficient or not. Very much a standards-based interpretation. Other metrics, percentile ranks, growth, standard scores, grade equivalents, bring with them different strengths and different weaknesses. So as you think about how to explore your own data, how to best move forward, think about the metrics themselves and the selection of assessments that give you metrics that allow you to make the statements that are very, very interpretable to your audiences. The next slide just simply says that again, but there's different metrics that allow you to match the interpretation you're trying to convey in a more explicit way. Sometimes it's just easier to have a clearer metric and be able to speak to your audiences, whether your audiences are board members, whether your audiences are parents, whether your audiences are the students themselves, but thinking through, again, sort of your audience with respect to that metric is very important. Attributes of scales, I'm sure this takes you all back to some measurement course you took as an undergraduate somewhere to understand in a test what kinds of metrics and what the PR meant, what this meant, and so forth. But understand those attributes. Understand that a change of 3 points on one scale is very different than a change of 20 points on another scale. So even though the metrics are different, those could be one and the same, or they could be significantly different, but understanding the attributes of the scale and what it actually means tied to your interpretation. And then we encourage comparisons. We encourage comparisons to, as we sort of find our way going forward, we can think back to 2018 and think, okay, maybe I want to get back. I want to get back to that point at some point in the future. And so those comparisons are part of this bigger complement of information. Okay, so norms in particular, which is the next slide.
And we're going to talk about norms in a kind of a different way than you might think of them. Lots of people think the purpose of norms in a norm referenced assessment is simply to compare a child's or a group's performance to a national sample. And while that's a very important purpose of norms, we're going to emphasize norms as a way of establishing a fixed frame of reference at a fixed point in time, so that we can understand patterns of change over time. And the importance of having that fixed point in time is going to become clear as we move through this next series of slides. So we can go on to the next one just to give you a sense of extremely long-term trends. These are trends in national norms for the Iowa assessments going way back to a time, as I said before, that we're not going to talk about very much, but which have allowed us over time to understand long-term trends just in the same way that NAEP does in their assessment. The NAEP plots started in 1990, and they are referencing student achievement today relative to where it was in the 1990 year when their long-term trend study took place. By the same token, the national norms for the Iowa assessments create a similar frame of reference, so that for any given point in time, if you're looking at norms that were established, for example, in 2017, that frame of reference is fixed, and any comparison going forward is relative to that fixed point in time, so that you can understand change over that period of times through normative types of scores. We can go to the next slide. And what we're used to is seeing a variety of metrics or scales that states in particular use to categorize achievement. The typical ones for accountability assessments that are used in every state are categorical. A student is labeled not proficient, proficient, or advanced. NAEP sometimes uses these kinds of scores to describe students who are basic, proficient, or advanced in their assessment. But as you saw in the NAEP example, NAEP also has other kinds of scales that they use to track change, and they would argue that long-term trend means something different than that categorical kind of scale that is used in statewide accountability assessments. What we're looking at in terms of national performance is being able to have a reference point that gives us a framework for understanding where achievement is now compared to where it was before the pandemic. And that's really what we're trying to focus on now in the rest of our conversation about norms. The next slide is just a little quickie to give us a breather. We can think about national percentile ranks as helping us move and follow a grade group, third graders in a given year, when they became fourth graders, when they became fifth graders. We can also look at norms from the standpoint of for a given grade, what performance looked like in 2020, in 2021, and 2022, and this is more of a grade level comparison. How are our third graders doing in each of these years? How are our fourth graders doing in each of these years? And those two kinds of ways of thinking about norms are reflected in this little graphic, where the column that's shaded green under third grade would be the approach I would be taking if I wanted to know where my third graders are in each of these years. So for the example I gave you in the state of Iowa, where we saw a dramatic drop in third grade performance after the pandemic, what we would want to do as a follow-up is look at grade 3 in subsequent years to see if the students who are coming into grade 3 next year have experienced the same kind of learning loss as those third graders had experienced during the pandemic, or if the new third graders that are coming in seem to be qualitatively different in terms of the skills they're carrying forward. Likewise, we might also be interested in, back to the previous one, we might also be interested in following a cohort longitudinally, and that's what the diagonal green rectangles represent. A look at third graders followed in subsequent years as they go through elementary and middle school. Okay.
So as we go forward, Anna, the taking those national percentile ranks again, as Steve said, knowing it's a fixed reference point, it's a benchmark that in the particular case of the Iowas was a 2017, but in other assessments, they're going to have that fixed point of time when there was a picture caught of national performance, for example, and that became our reference back. This case, I can then use that information, those national percentiles, and I can look at patterns. I can, for instance, if we went forward one more, Anna, I can see for the 3 years that were prior to COVID, I can see for a given individual, or it could be a group, it could be a group of interests, it could be a district, it could be a class, it could be a state, but I'm interested in looking at that consistency. So between 17 and 19, for instance, in reading, these students or this group of individuals remained fairly constant. They were going from 75th to 76th to 74, very, very consistent. We then saw in 2020 their performance dramatically changed, and their average PR was 55, a significant loss. Now, subsequent to that first fall of 2020, when they were administering, we could see data points post where we're showing growth coming back out. So in a metric like a national percentile rank, it allows us to look across and make those very direct comparisons back.
And an important point to understand about the national percentile ranks that are illustrated here, this works if the norms that produce the national percentile ranks use a fixed frame of reference. In many assessment programs, national norms are recalculated every year. And so the meaning of a percentile rank in 2017 isn't the same as the meaning of that in 2018 with respect to change. And so that's an important point here, and would also apply to statewide assessments that might report percentile ranks in addition to other kinds of scores, that those percentile ranks may well have been calculated not with respect to a fixed frame of reference at a certain point pre-pandemic, but with respect to the current assessment year. And so those are very different things, and what we're talking about here only works with that fixed frame of reference.
And I think that takes us back to when you think about an assessment and the metrics that you're interested in using, knowing exactly what the metric is. What is that point of reference, and how is it calculated? Is it stable, or is it changing with people, are critical elements to understand about that. So I think we've addressed the why pre-COVID. We're looking for things that allow us, when things have been interrupted, when there's been change, when there's been significant in past times of education reform, we're interested in understanding what's happening. And those fixed points of reference help us by providing that fixed benchmark. Okay, the next slide just says, we all know some of the cautions around interpretation of norms as well. So we want to be sure, in going back to be sure the metrics and the assessments that you select, if you want to make this sort of comparison, are the appropriate ones. So they're only as good as the data that's gone into the data collections. Understand that they're only as good as the procedures that were used and the appropriateness of the reference group and so forth. So again, just as sort of another caution piece, an encouragement to really understand what you're looking at over and over. Okay, the next slide just simply says, well, why? These are just examples of questions that I could answer. And if I could answer and look at changes, if I'm comparing reading to math, for instance, in your building, I can make that change. If I want to say, we have limited resources, we're bringing in additional people next year, where is our most dramatic need? I can identify relative to others the reading versus the mathematics. I can look at groups of students within and better understand. So it can help me go deeper. It can help me go to that level that helps me sort of parlay that into helping your own recovery locally. Okay, so as we wrap up this section, considerations for moving forward, and that's the next slide. Sorry, Anna. Thank you. We know there are multiple sources of information are extremely important. And we always want to say it's a much, much bigger world than any given test. And even the test itself is just one piece of a really complicated education system. So even though you're listening to an hour about metrics and growth and interpretation of COVID, we know that this is one piece of a much more complicated picture. But the takeaways here are think multiple sources of information, and always consider the metric that you're trying to start with. The question, start with what you want to answer for your audiences, and then choose the assessments, the metrics, the ways you want to go to address that. National norms are fixed. National norms are one way that can complement other sources of information. I think one thing you want to do locally is understand you have teacher input, you have your own district level assessments, you have other metrics. Every state has their own way that they put together multiple metrics to come up with a greater picture. Understanding the components of that, I know here in the state of Iowa, we have things like graduation rates, absentee rates, retention rates. Those are all part of a much larger picture, but if you need to dig deeper to better understand where to go next. And then those national PRs, again, can allow you to do that by looking at the pros and cons, the growth and the loss for individuals or groups. Okay, we're going to move into a second complement to that on the interpretation of growth through metrics. So the next slide just says, we're making some assumptions when we measure growth. And maybe the next slide, and yeah, we assume students, and I think if there's one thing we're trying to say today, students are at very different places right now, maybe more so than they ever have been, that the pandemic created more variability than we've ever seen before. But we also know that regardless of where a student is, we can measure where they are going forward. That growth is our metric to allow us to get to that point. And that growth can translate itself into a goal. And setting a goal that's specific for a student or an instructional group of students or something very specific and very tangible for your classroom teachers, part of the assumption that what we mean when we say growth. We're not just talking descriptively growth, we're talking about actionable growth. So the next slide talks about growth scales themselves. A lot of assessments have different growth scales, and we are making the assumptions that there's an underlying scale that describes a student's location on a continuum of achievement. That achievement may go from kindergarten through 12th grade or some subset of that, but there is a continuum of achievement. We also are assuming that there are measurable differences along that continuum. I can look at two students in different places and understand where they are. I can also look at where Steve was last year and where Steve is this year, and I can quantify that. And I can do that, and that interpretation has some meaning to it. And I can use this type of growth scale to measure over and over and over time, group over group, and so forth. And then we also need some point of reference for this one as well. So oftentimes growth scales might give you an expected or an estimated or most likely where your student will be the next year, a projection into the future to allow you to, again, use that to better understand and set goals.
And before we go to the next slide, I want to say that this aspect, this term growth scales, is very important. We're trying to, when we say a growth scale, we're looking for a metric that actually reflects change directly. And what you'll see in the next slide is the fact that for a student who is typical, average, at the median in a given grade and stays in that position relative to his or her peers, relative to national performance, will remain at the 50th percentile across all of these grades. And so when we look at a trend line of this sort, for the purposes of understanding individual or groups of student groups growth over time, the flat line doesn't show the students are changing in any direct way. We have to understand more about the percentile rank metric in order to get there. So that's why we do move to the next slide. And we establish a growth scale that shows how students across these grades who might be at the 50th percentile nationally are marching up that achievement continuum. The students in grade 8 who are at the 50th percentile have learned tremendous amounts of mathematics relative to the students who are at that same NPR in the 3rd grade level. And the numeric properties of this growth scale that we call our national standard score scale reflect that growth. Growth similarly can be examined at other points in the distribution. So we've included an example at the 75th percentile. But the important point here is that the metric shows that change is happening with respect to the underlying skills that are being measured in tests across this grade span. The next slide just translates that pattern into a line graph that goes up instead of just remains horizontal. Now, this is a student who is an example of a student who's remaining at the same percentile rank that is relative to other students, but does show that the student is in fact learning a great deal of mathematics or reading or whatever the content domain might be across these grade spans. A similar property exists for the grade equivalent scale. If you're a school that likes to reference change with respect to grade levels, that's what grade equivalents have done for years. And what we saw more than anything else that I found interesting about the national reports about the effects of the pandemic is that regardless of the source of information, regardless of the metrics that were shown, in the end, the interpretable information about how much learning loss was experienced at a given point in time in a given locale is, well, this difference translates into about 6 months of instruction, so that the grade equivalent scale may well find some utility for you depending on your needs with respect to understanding change and communicating that to other audiences.
The next slide simply shows, again, sort of how I can use growth. Here we have mapped 3 different students. And the point of reference here is an expected growth for a student that starts out at 176. And I can see that blue line sort of climbing across those 4 different data points, where when I compare that to how 3 individual students are doing, I can again sort of see the amount of change that's going on. I can quantify that. I can interpret that downward trend for student number 1. I can interpret that sort of flatter starting out point for student number 3, and then a more major growth trajectory. And I think if looking at groups of growth are always important, but when you start to understand individuals for growth, it's extremely important too, because here I would have very different plans for my 3 students that are represented here, all coming from the same cohort, but they're on very different sort of trajectories. Their performance patterns have shown that they've sort of gotten there in different ways. So again, just another example of how a metric like growth can be used to illustrate what's happening at your district.
And any scale that is used in an assessment for purposes of showing growth, like the standard score scale that we've been talking about. Previous slide, please, Anna. Any such scale should be able to mark off a line like that blue line, so that between 2 assessment points, something about the amount of growth and change with respect to this metric can be determined. If a student grows 30 points, it'd be nice to know that 30 points is 20 points more than would have been expected, so that that expected growth line is something that you should be able to find out about any vertical scale from any assessment that you're using for purposes of interpretation.
And to make one more point on this slide, I would have very different goals for student number 2 than I would for student number 3. Student number 2 started at a very, very different point. So my goal is different for that student. Now that student is moving forward. That student in different metrics might always be a not yet proficient or not proficient in your state, but we're seeing growth in that student moved from 161 to 183 in this period of time. So that student was growing. They may never have gotten over a threshold that put them into a proficiency category, but by looking at growth, you can say something positive about that student's change in these 3 years and where you would want that student to be shooting for the fall of 2023. You also wouldn't want to all of a sudden give the student number 2 a goal to say, I need you to be up to 220 by next year. I can look at that growth and understand what is realistic and yet push forward at the same time. So it's sort of that common sense that we all have when we're dealing with students to better understand we're trying to motivate, but also want to put it within their reach. Okay, so as we leave this, the next slide is simply, as we think about growth, it helps us establish goals, really, really tangible goals. It's also really, I think, easy to understand and translate that into messages for the student and to translate that in messages for parents. And I think, again, going back to metrics and attributes of metrics, growth is a positive message. We're seeing growth post-COVID. It's not as fast as we would like. We're not back to where we once were, but there is growth. And so part of that recovery message is a positive message.
And to be able to convey to students, regardless of their level of achievement, that they are marching up an overall achievement scale over the span of their schooling, I think is an important feature of a true growth scale.
Okay, our last section. Thanks for hanging with us. What about the types of measures? First, the next slide simply says, we understand not only, and maybe even the next slide, we know multiple measures. Again, we've all heard it. We know observations. We know a student walks into a classroom on a given day, and that is a measure of how kind of day that student is having. Those are all measures. But we also know there's some external measures that come in and help us be sure that my read by the teacher is the appropriate read, whether we're consistent in our concerns about the student and so forth. But even within those externals, there's a broad sort of variety of assessments out there, from achievement, what we've been talking about today, but might be very much complemented by ability measures and maybe very complemented by social emotional learning measures. So as you put together your sort of your toolbox, you have to think broadly about the types of measures that you want to use that can maybe serve multiple purposes and get to the end and provide that more comprehensive view for you. The next two are just simply sort of reiterating that oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Steve.
I would go forward and I'd just say this is a nice example of a toolbox. It's a little bit better organized than my own, but it is a metaphor for the kind of way you would want to be thinking about choosing a set of tools that provide you with the information needed to improve instruction and learning for your students.
And the next one is just, again, as you're looking at that complement of assessments for your own purposes, be sure you look at those that measure with confidence, those that measure with high reliability, those that measure with accuracy. And find assessments that support metrics or messages. The word metric is sometimes off-putting, but messages that can be explained, easily explained and understood to parents and students. And select those that give you performance measures, growth measures. You're not only interested in a status, but you're interested in that growth. So as you look to an assessment, look to those metrics again. So we just want to spend the next 5 minutes or so, because we're running out of time, is talking about how you might implement this locally. And I think we'll go quickly here, but a couple of these, obviously this is a process. This is the process we're suggesting. It's very much an iterative process. I think we're going to be constantly rethinking this as we move forward and as we add additional data points. But historical data, I think, can't be overemphasized right now. That gives you a starting point. If you are looking and studying where your group was prior to COVID, and maybe the next slide, Anna helps us, you need to understand where your students were. Who were they? Were they very stable before COVID hit? Or are you in a district where you have a lot of transition? Are you in a district that's changing? Are you in a district that the student population looks very different today than it did 10 years ago? So understand historically what your gaps were. understand historically what your student performance levels were and so forth, and then go to the share the new data. And the next slide, Anna, sharing the new data helps us then compare back to that, the changes in your student population. Did the same students come back in 2020 or 2021 that were there in 2019? And understanding how, did I have more students within a certain group come back, fewer students in other groups? Were my gaps widening? Were my gaps lessening in that period of time? Again, but very specific to your own district, your own school, and think of it for your audiences with respect to the historical, what you knew about your historical. Okay, thanks, Anna. The next couple slides just simply show sort of different things we can do. I've just modeled 5 years of data here based on some things we have in the state of Iowa from 18 to 22. I've put in 2 different metrics here, a growth metric, a standard score metric, and a PR metric, that fixed benchmark metric. So here, if I'm trying to encourage you to look at your historical data, I would look at that 18-19 data. I would look at the consistency in that 3rd grade, 65th percentile both years. I would look across all of those years, all those grades, I'm so sorry, and look at how consistent are they. And you can see from this district, I see consistency. At least for the 2 years prior, I see consistency. If I go forward then, on the next slide, I can see my first year, my fall after the spring of 20 with the pandemic, and I can see that change, and I can see, and I could map this with individuals, I can map it with students that are recipients of free and reduced lunch, I can map that with any group of interest, but I can look at that change. I can see where my significant changes occurred. In 3rd grade, those children went from 65 as an average percentile rank down to 48 as an average percentile rank in that 1 year. That was significant. I can quantify that. I can use the scale, the standard score scale, to say they went from 184 to 175.35, and I can interpret that. I can interpret that in months of learning loss. I can interpret that in weeks of learning loss, and I can do something with that to help me better understand, because again, maybe we don't want to focus there, but what's going to be really important is that as I compare it to 21 and 22, I can bring myself back out and talk in those same metrics and use those to look at the recovery effort.
That particular case is a nice example of what we saw in 3rd grade reading in the state of Iowa, because when we went back and looked at historical data, we saw a great deal of stability in the results of statewide, the results in a grade 3 reading. These were before the pandemic students who had very stable early reading instruction, and the influence of the pandemic was a complete disruption of that, and it revealed itself in a dramatic decline of performance of the incoming 3rd graders in 2020.
And to Steve's point, I can follow those same 3rd graders on the next slide by saying those students that were actually in 3rd grade in 2018, they remained at that 65th. But the next year they were going up. As 4th graders, they were doing well. They went up to 71. And they, as a cohort of matched individuals, did not struggle as much as the 3rd grade classroom. So my 3rd grade, I would want to use this for my own evaluation of my programs. And are my 3rd graders coming into 3rd grade prepared? Have they been exposed to the correct standards and so forth? Because the students, as the next, well, as this slide will show, the 65, 65, 48, as I go across grade 3, is a very different message than the 65 going up to the 71 and then back down to the 62. Those are 2 pieces of information that are both important to understanding the bigger picture. The next slide shows, again, if I pick a given grade, grade 6, the point, and again, I can see that there's something unusual going on as students are coming into grade 6. we're losing. Regardless, if I could map all the diagonals on here as matched cohorts, I would see that in general, 6th grade seems like a difficult year. And we've seen that consistently in our state as students here might change buildings, they might change the approach to curriculum. We also see in our state that there's a real change in the standards, particularly in mathematics in our state. So things like that, understanding better why all of a sudden in 6th grade, and 6th graders are a different group of kids than 5th graders as well. They're growing up. So, and the last one on this theme is I can also look and quantify that loss. So I can look at PR changes and understand that a PR change indicates about 8 months of loss of instruction.
Provided the PRs are referenced to that fixed frame of reference that we talked about before and are not percentile ranks that are calculated from the data of a given assessment year.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, and as we look forward, I think what we've tried to do is shine the spotlight on data, ways to think about data, ways in which your assessment program can leverage data appropriately with the appropriate metric tied to your purpose in using an assessment results. All of this works much better if you have a very stable assessment program, or if you're looking forward to establishing a very stable assessment program, because as the assessments change, the interpretation of information becomes difficult over time. So I think on that note, we're ready to turn it back to our colleagues at Assessment Central or wherever you're located.
Awesome. Well, Cathy and Steve, thank you so much. I took copious notes throughout that entire presentation, and I hope our audience got something really valuable from that will help them practically understand how their students are moving forward. We have about 2 minutes left, and we had a few questions come in through the chat, and I want to make sure we can at least get to one or two. So the first question that came in is, where do you look to find if norms are based on a fixed frame of reference? Where can people find out that information within an assessment?
Well, any kind of technical documentation that supports the assessment. So usually every assessment will have something posted to their website that talks about the norm and how the norms were established.
Okay, so the technical guide of the assessment would be a great place.
Yes.
Awesome. Another question that came in is, Minnesota is a discrepancy state. And so based on the data that you're showing, we're going to be qualifying kids for SLD who do not have disabilities, just based on the differences between the WJ norm in 2019 versus now. Do you have any thoughts on that?
With respect to the policy, I wouldn't want to try to weigh in too carefully, simply because I'm not familiar with the details of that policy. But to the extent that there's any possibility of referencing scores on the WJ, current scores on the WJ to a previous set of norms, that would help establish what we would have called a pre-COVID or pre-pandemic frame of reference.
Awesome. Vicki, any last minute thoughts or questions for Cathy and Steve while we have them?
You know, not at this time. It was an excellent job. For those of us that aren't really familiar with statistics and, you know, how do you interpret these scores, this was quite a nice overview of how you would be using this kind of information. Really appreciate it.
Agreed. Thank you so much, Cathy and Steve. And for all of our audience members, we will be sending out the recording and the slides. And please reach out if you have any follow-up questions. We'd love to help support you with your assessment programs. With that, I'll conclude us for today and hope to see you on an upcoming webinar soon. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.